thank you guys for sticking around to listen to us. It's been quite a year for digital platforms in Europe. If you own an iPhone, you may have felt some of the big differences in your user experience brought on by the DMA. I personally, the first changes I noticed, I didn't see until I joined my new employer, Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal, when I got my new work phone with a Belgian number. And all of a sudden I got a choice screen, so I got to choose a different browser, which was fun. It's weird being starstruck by a piece of legislation. But that also means that the landscape is shifting significantly, both for big tech and for the developers that use the operating systems and app stores that they cherish to make money. And at the same time, there's plenty of tension on either side. Apple is fighting a string of court cases against the DMA decisions, including on the most recent non-compliance decision and fine earlier this year. The Commission is now taking a deeper look at Google and Apple's App Store changes, and we're yet to find out whether the Commission is happy with those new fee structures. And we also don't know how much more will change as consumer demand for things like AI chatbots evolve, or whether the things that we're seeing in Europe now are going to be templated in other markets where there are parallel pieces of legislation that are kind of coming into the fore. So joining me today are panelists that you know very well and who don't need an introduction, but I've kind of started now, so I guess I'll just continue. We've got Thomas Cramler, one of DG Comp's heads of units on digital platforms, spearheading the DMA's unit's efforts. We've got Francesco Versace, an Associate Director of Government Affairs at Spotify. Spotify, as you guys all well know, is one of the companies that's most excited about the DMA and is very vocal about its enforcement. And Kay Giavelli, Senior Director for Europe at the US Tech Industry Association Chamber of Progress, which counts a broad church of tech groups amongst its members, amongst its corporate partners, including gatekeepers, Apple and Google, and also Amazon. So, without further ado, I wanted to start with a question for Thomas. The DMA is still a young law, but what are the shifts we've seen over the past year on mobile platforms? Tell us about how well it's working.
I'm going to talk about something that has nothing to do with the DMA, but you as competition lawyers, you'll love it, the counterfactual. So where did we start? We started 3 years ago with a closed ecosystem on iOS. Basically, there were no alternatives. You'd have to deal with Apple in order to distribute on the platform. Similar things on Google, a bit less closed. The payment system of the platform you had to use, there were no choices. You could not advertise. You couldn't even send an email to your customers. You couldn't even say, go to my website and get something cheaper there. That was prohibited. And there was no interoperability. So your Garmin watch didn't really work with your Apple iPhone. That's where we started. So the counterfactual 2 years forward, now we have alternative app stores. We have app stores with new business models. We have app stores that provide services that consumers didn't have before. Streaming games, for instance. That wasn't possible on the iPhone. Now it's even possible on the iPhone, interestingly. Now that an app store, an alternative app store on the iPhone provides the same service, Apple has decided to also make that available on its own app store. So interestingly, innovation is also spurred through the back door, if you want. So we have that. We have the Epic Store back on the iPhone. We have no advertising restrictions, so you can now communicate as you like with your customer in your app. We have no restrictions on payment choices, so you can use your in-app payment system of the platform, or you can use your own in-app payment system, and you have interoperability with connected devices. So your earphones or your connected TV or your smart watch will work much better with the iPhone in this case than before. So there are quite some changes actually if you think about it in a very short span of time. But obviously there's a lot of impatience in the market, I have to say, and I'm sure Francesco will tell me about all of his impatience in a second. One shouldn't underestimate how long it takes to make this business model changes. And I think in the last panel we discussed about cultural changes. It takes cultural changes, it takes the willingness on the company's side to make these changes, and sometimes it also needs to stick. So what we need to do, I think, as a regulator, as opposed to an antitrust enforcer, we need to use both carrot and stick. And 90% of our work, I would say, and that echoes what has been said in the previous panel, is actually regulatory, real regulatory work in regulatory dialogues. And the 10% that you see is the tip of the iceberg. That's when we need to use the stick in order to bring the companies back to the table. When they don't want to negotiate or don't want to discuss, then we need to resort to fines and penalties and what have you. But that's not the goal. The goal is that we are regulating these markets, which means we are dialoguing with companies, if that's the English word. With companies, we are trying to find solutions. And as I said, 90% of our work is that. 10% of our work is using the stick when the carrot doesn't work. But these are gradual improvements that the DMA will bring to markets. The opportunities that the DMA offers, they will have to be taken up by businesses. And it's not us that create business models. It's the businesses that have to follow up. So all of this has already been done in a very short time span. We are not yet there, and I admit that. There's the big question of the fees, and I'm sure we're going to hear about this in a panel. What kind of fee structure can these gatekeepers have? Can they still charge fees for services that they're providing? Are they providing any services? Are these services useful to the companies, to the developers in this case? Do they reflect the value of the service that they are providing? These are the questions that we need to be grappling with, and they are not easy ones. They are real regulatory questions. That's what a regulator will have to do at one point in time. If you compare it with other sorts of regulations, at one point in time, you end up with having to look into fees. And that's where we are now. And that's the most complicated thing that we have to grapple with. We're not yet there. There's a lot of impatience in the market. I understand that. But the big bang, I think, was not to be expected. The DMA will lead to gradual changes, and it will take a bit of time. I understand that this is not what a lot of people in the market want, but this is the reality of the regulation.
Thank you, Thomas. I especially enjoyed the idea of this kind of like tension between the impatience of the market. You know, at the end of the day, this is a new piece of legislation, things are going to bake in. But Francesco, I seem to remember that Spotify had a wish list when the DMA was just coming into the fore. So can you tell me a little bit about where you guys feel like you are with that wish list and if there's more that you want?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much, Capital Forum and Jordan Partners, for assembling this great event with such an expert crowd. So it's an honor. Before getting to that, I will just talk about a trade-off between goals. I think especially Thomas, as regulator, always is confronted with trade-off in finding the best policy outcome. I see one here between impatience and getting it right. I think the Commission at this stage has done a lot of progress and should err towards getting it right, rather than taking rash solutions based on what currently is on the table. Looking at where we were at Spotify, so in January 24, we published a blog post outlining how we envisioned our new app in Europe to become live thanks to the DMA. And as probably many of you know, the main issue for us in relation to Apple has always been that for our free users that aim to discover and convert to premium, has always been extremely difficult to actually find the information and the right consumer journey to convert. And that's very important to us and for music streaming in general, because conversion to premium subscription is really the bulk of the revenues. It's no surprise, it's not a mystery that there were significant hurdles, and there still are, from Apple in that respect, both in the sense of very high fees that in our case are completely non-economical, and with restrictions to even before March 24 to even communicating to free users how much a subscription costs. So what we actually aim for is a seamless and free of charge, as we believe the law states, way for users to be linked out to our website and to purchase a subscription. It's as simple as that. Looking forward, in our wish list, let's say there were other things as well. The ability to offer new services and better services to European users. We are entering into audiobooks and we are launching them progressively. We already have those in some new markets. The audiobook model is a bit different from the subscription model because it can also allow purchases a la carte. And obviously, if the same fees apply to that, that's going to be a hurdle as well. And potentially in the future, we are looking at opportunities arising from alternative app stores and even creating super fan clubs where actually artists can tailor an experience and products to their own fan bases. And we are not there yet. So as Thomas said, there has been a lot of very good development, and I actually commend the Commission for having put a lot of effort in serious work into this. Indeed, now we can at least communicate prices to users. That's also a result of the music streaming case that found a conclusion in March 24. But now it can be extended to other apps. That's important. But when it comes to the link-out process, we see that basically as a no-go for us because of the uneconomical impact of the various fees, which really, from our perspective, amount to the situation pre-DMA. So we haven't seen really, there have been many changes, we can go to that later, but de facto, it's the same impact.
Thomas, can I just ask you a little bit about that, about Francesco's or Spotify's frustration with this link-out process? I believe the Commission's kind of in the final stages of testing Apple's new store term fees to, see how happy you are with that. What kind of noise are you hearing from developers and other people in the market as in terms of like the actual practical application of how Apple's new terms actually work?
One overarching response, it's complicated. It's too complicated because many developers don't really understand what is on the table now. I think there is really a burden, especially on Apple, but also on Google, to better explain what actually the rules are. And some of the rules that Francesco mentioned, they are not explained in very clear terms, put it mildly, by the gatekeepers that have put them out. Because there's some advantages actually that probably aren't really seen in the market because they're not really explained. For instance, promoting through static links, that means basically telling your users you can find my subscription much cheaper on my website. That actually in Apple's newest proposal should come free of any charges. And that's not very clear, I have to admit, in what they've put out. And therefore, there's a lot of work to be done, not necessarily on the Commission side, but more on the gatekeeper side to explain the rules that they've put in, or they want to put in place and why they are compliant.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I wanted to ask you as well about that, because obviously Chamber of Progress has a broad church of partners. Uber and Airbnb are among those as well. So I just wondered, from your perspective, how closely do you think smaller US tech companies are looking at what's happening in Europe and what changes are happening over here?
Yeah, I think, and yeah, for those who don't know more about Chamber of Progress, you might know me from previous work that I've done, but Chamber of Progress, we are a left of center tech association, only started up in Brussels last year. So it's great, thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak on this issue. We obviously have a big interest in DMA. We are supported by a broad church, but including gatekeepers as well, so have a wide variety of perspectives. And in terms of the smaller companies, I mean, it's interesting. I think you mentioned Uber and Airbnb, that are both companies that sell things in the real world, so they don't rely on digital subscriptions. So, congratulations, becoming profitable. It's a big milestone. I wonder how much of that can be attributed to the success of the DMA. But these other companies, they do care about, well, if we're forcing Apple to change its business model, does that perhaps mean that costs are going to go up for us? In one way or another, because if the biggest users of the distribution, the ones that are basically paying for it, are now getting free distribution, does everyone else who currently gets free distribution now have to start paying more? But that's just like one of the smaller issues. I think a bigger perspective, I mean, I think a lot of the US tech companies are taking a wait-and-see approach for the DMA. I don't think it's very popular, especially not in Silicon Valley, to want to build a company that is based on or on top of access provided by and controlled by government. There's a lot more of a, well, let's build something that isn't reliant on what other companies are doing, or the graces of regulators. And funnily enough, in the last few years since the DMA, we've seen some successes. The DMA was built on the logic that there are these entrenched gatekeeper digital monopolies that are stifling innovation and competition in the digital space. But since the DMA was passed, we've had companies like OpenAI and DeepSeek and Mistral and Anthropic become top app stores with the free distribution of the app stores, but also now in discussions of, oh, well, maybe these companies should be gatekeepers as well, which I think, speaking of like counterfactuals, there's also the factual of without the benefits of the DMA, we have seen a lot of companies, new digital companies, potential future gatekeepers emerging in the current ecosystem. Maybe competition wasn't as bad as we had thought. And I think the other aspect for these companies, especially the US ones, is that the DMA and some of the other regulations that we've seen, like the Data Act and current discussions around financial data access regulation, are raising bigger questions about Europe's posture towards US tech companies. And there's increasing discussion around, well, we need to be quote unquote digitally sovereign. I think that raises concerns about protectionist measures that could mean closing the market access and calling into question what does trade and an international economy look like in the future.
Just respond to the AI point. Sounds a bit like competition is just one click away. We've heard that before. On AI, I mean, you might be right. It could be the next wave of disruptive innovation, but it could also be the next gateway if you want to monopolization. We don't know yet. The question is rather, do we have a close look at it, or do we just let it go? I think that's rather the question we should be asking. We don't want to be too late, but we also don't want to be too early. And that's a difficult one for every authority or every regulator. No? When do you start seriously looking into things?
Francesco, did you want to add something?
Yeah, indeed. I just wanted to react to a couple of points that Kai made. First of all, thank you for the congratulations. Indeed, 24 was our first full year profitability in 20 years. And the reason why we got to that so late is that not many people know that the music streaming business model basically goes into a setup where every euro generated in revenues by a Spotify or another service, around 70% of that goes into right holders remuneration, which is why this means two things, that the margins are quite tight, which is also why then we cannot afford to pay up to 30% in fee per each subscriber, per each installment forever. Number two, it means that the success of the streaming industry is linked to the success, in a positive way, of the creators. And I don't think here the point is about getting things for free. I think the point here is about getting value at the right price. And that's not what we see, because what we see is basically a set of services which, as Kai mentioned, are charged by Apple for some developers, not for others. It's very obvious if you look at the store services fees. Those are services that all developers enjoy, but only digital good and service developers are charged. There is no clear reason why. And there is no competition to that. So if I wanted to have a competitor providing service of app update or app review, there is no market for that. So that leads the gatekeeper to actually charge very high. And the whole point of the DMA, one of the 2 points, was contestability in addition to fairness, and that's what we don't see. So it's not really about not paying for the value. Also, last point on that, there is significant value that's brought to app stores by the developers which make app stores interesting because nobody goes onto an app store just to be on the app store. They go on the app store to do things. So this double, let's say, source of value should always be recognized.
I'm glad that you brought up doing things because I also wanted to talk about innovation, or rather the debate around innovation that the DMA creates. Now, there are a few arguments that gatekeepers give routinely about why the DMA is bad for them, and I'm going to kind of try and take the two main ones in turn, but we'll start with innovation. Companies like Apple say that they're withholding services in the EU so far because they don't know how to make them regulatory compliant. It curtails their ability to innovate themselves. So I guess the question that I want to put to all of you is, which is more important, the gatekeeper's ability to innovate or smaller companies? Kay, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think that's really a useful perspective to have, because a lot of the logic of the DMA is that, in my view, that the gatekeepers are stifling innovation on the platform, and we want to stop them from doing that, enable more innovation on the platform, and any reduction in innovation that we're going to have between platforms competing with each other, or from the gatekeeper itself, that's going to be more than compensated by the innovation from all these on-platform, in-ecosystem complementors who are able to innovate. And I think it's you know, we'll see how that goes. I think we have seen, you know, ultimately innovation. What's important for innovation? It's not, in my view and in Chamber of Progress's view, it's not about more profits for the company. It's about quality of services, things getting better, things getting cheaper, more efficient for users, for consumers. And so we are seeing some things getting better. Thomas mentioned a bunch of them. For those who weren't here for the first panel, we also have choice screens. We also have control over data combinations. We have improved access to data for business users. We have less personalized ads on Meta, though question if anyone's actually interested in that. So we have a lot of things, but at the same time, we have some potential negative impacts on users. We have, because ultimately opportunities for rivals means to some extent less integrated services, more friction, less convenience. Question of, okay, well, choice or convenience. There was a survey that was commissioned by CCIA, which has a lot of gatekeepers as members, but that found that people aren't really happy about the DMA's impacts in Europe. European consumers, 5,000 were surveyed. I would love to see the Commission doing a survey to get some information directly from consumers, maybe as part of this DMA review. So I think, yes, we're seeing some innovations that have been delayed. You mentioned Apple. They had this live translation on earpods that they had been announced recently, along with their announcement that, okay, well, maybe we need to repeal the DMA, I think they went as far as to say, which is quite far to say. I don't think there's more you could do in terms of objection. But there's also the iPhone mirroring, there's multimodal GPT models that have been delayed or not released. AI overviews have been delayed. So I think we are seeing that balance play out and it is, I think, too early to tell, because we will have more innovation coming from the ecosystem complementers, and then we just have to see how much more innovations are being delayed by the gatekeepers themselves.
Thanks very much, Kay. I want to turn to Francesco in a minute to talk about a little bit more, because you mentioned all the other things that Spotify wants to look into in terms of DMA changes. But Thomas, just to you first. So how do you guys in the Commission weigh up this question of innovation when you're looking at mobile platforms? Like, how do you kind of strike that balance?
I think here I'm with Ian. Actually, history teaches us some lessons. If you look back into, I think it's not disruptive innovations or the real big game changers in the industry. They haven't come from regulation. It's the businesses that innovate. It's not the regulators that innovate. What the regulators can do is to protect incremental innovations, the small steps, not the big change, the move from the mainframe to the PC, that wasn't because of the IBM case, I think, in the past, to stay with your example. But this incremental innovation that you open up platforms for complementers, as you rightly say, okay, that's important, and that's what the DMA is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be helping those who are reliant on the platforms, in this case when we talk about mobile ecosystems, the developers, to bring innovative services to the market. I spoke about the streaming games, actually. That for a long time wasn't possible on the iOS platform. I don't know why, actually. Now it seems to be possible, and third-party app stores can make use of it. So that's an innovation that a complementer, a third-party app store, has brought to the market. So we should be looking at this small incremental innovation that opens up, or that helps developers, in this case, competing with the platforms. We are not, I think, there to enable the big disruptive innovations. That would be far too daring to say that the DMA would be doing. And then one last sentence on rollout. In the end, when you look at what has been happening, I think all of these services have eventually been rolled out with a bit of delay, probably. I don't know why. You'd have to ask the companies. There's also language issues sometimes, I would assume. So I think in the end, AI overviews are here. AI mode is going to come. All the other services, there's this translation service, I think it's going to come at one point in time to Europe. So I don't really see how this has an impact on the innovative capacity on the markets here.
I just wanted to ask as well, because Kay does make an interesting point about a consumer survey. How do you guys, on a practical level, think about how everyday users are using their devices? How do you factor that into your assessments?
You wouldn't believe how much consumer feedback we actually get when some changes are done on the platforms. We got a lot of consumer feedback about Google Maps, for instance, and so we do take that into account. We're not going out, or haven't yet gone out, and we haven't done surveys. There's the review process which is going on. But hopefully, associations like BEUC can help us to bring the consumer's view to the table, because to go out and ask millions of consumers is not very practicable. So we have to rely on consumer associations to give us their views, and they are very active, I have to say, and very helpful to give us the consumer perspective.
Francesco, back to you and talking about the wonderful wish list that Spotify had and the future innovations. As somebody whose Spotify Wrapped makes up most of their personality, I'm quite personally invested in these things. So are there any plans that maybe Spotify didn't even have before the DMA came into effect and you saw practically what was possible that now you're kind of like thinking about a little bit? Or is there, or if you could just go into a little bit more depth about how you're thinking about the other things on the wish list and how you kind of want to execute them going forward, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think for us it's really more about execution. As I said before, our new big thing that we are rolling out is audiobooks. That's a new segment of the audio space where we find a lot of promise. It's very different from music and podcasts because it has its own licensing arrangements, which are very different from music. So this is why we are gradually rolling it out. But actually, on that, so on executing at higher speed and getting to more uptake to what consumers want, I can actually mention a very concrete example where there was the ability to do that faster and better, and there was no trade-off with innovation from the gatekeeper. And as you all probably know, because you're an expert crowd, there was a recent injunction in the US in relation to the Epic versus Apple case, which actually in end of May led to Apple lifting all these restrictions without any kind of trade-offs. Obviously, they're appealing that. So what happened is that that night, where this came about, I can share a small story about that. We woke up our engineers in Sweden. It was late at night for them, and we told them, you need to actually work on a new app. A new app which allows link, buy buttons for both subscription and audiobooks. They did that because actually we were concerned that Apple had lifted the restrictions but then would reimpose them 1 day or two later. That app was approved by Apple within 24 hours, which is quite fast in the standard. And there was no core technology fee, no core technology commission, no complaint about this stifling innovation at their end. Obviously, this is very different from the DMA. It's it's a US court decision. But this shows that sometimes its trade-offs are really made on purpose to show to show problems that are not really linked to that very legislation. And actually, I cannot share the data, of course, but we saw significant uptake in terms of subscriptions and audiobooks in the US as a result of that. It appears that actually, if you show users how much things cost and where to buy them, they actually like it.
That's interesting. I also was interested in the kind of the point that you make about trade-offs and the sort of intentional trade-offs that are made. Kind of brings me to the next challenge that gatekeepers make about the DMA, which is about privacy and security of their services. Now, a few months ago, Apple made a little bit of a song and dance about the fact that a new alternative app store was able to set up shop on iPhones, and it was a pornographic app store. So, which they say, is harmful to children. And it makes their products less safe, and it's not really their brand. I think Apple has been one of the most vocal when it comes to privacy and security. So, I guess what I'd like to know from the panel is, do you think that there's any obligation for companies to run, clean services and smartphones under the DMA, and whether you do actually see a tension between some of the tech regulations that Brussels has, and whether there's a tension in complying with all of them? And when you're kind of weighing up values of harms to children, harms to privacy and security, harms to consumer opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic. And if you want to dive into it, the specification decisions from the Commission are quite enlightening. I can't say I've read, it's 400 pages or more in total. I can't say I've read all of it, but I have had a quick look. And thanks again to the organizers for encouraging me to do so before this panel. It's always nice to have a deadline to encourage you to do your homework. Well, so I think it's interesting because of a couple of statements that the Commission makes in the recitals there. So this is all in the kind of the context of interoperability, potentially creating new vulnerabilities, more attack surfaces. And I was also at the workshop a couple weeks ago, which Alexandre mentioned, that the JRC hosted and put together with a lot of great papers from economists presenting some of the effects of the DMA. And there was one paper there as well that talked about how interoperability in previous cases has led to greater cybersecurity threats. There was this paper last week, the ENISA Threat Landscape, the annual one. ENISA is the EU Agency for Cybersecurity, and they published an 87-page report that said mobile threats account for the largest share of cybersecurity threats at 42.4, web threats following with 27.3. And that Q1 of this year observed an increased level of reporting pertaining to the targeting of mobile devices, with Android devices facing a higher level of threat. So in this kind of context, I think it's very interesting that the Commission says in the recitals that on the one hand, compliance with specific obligations in the areas of data protection and security falls within the competence of the public authorities in charge of those respective sectors, Recital 105, not gatekeepers. So it's not for gatekeepers to protect security and data protection. That's, and of course, that's the competence of the public authorities. So, I know all the cyber criminals definitely follow GDPR law, definitely, abide by all cybersecurity laws. So good that it's the responsibility of the public authorities and not the gatekeeper to gatekeep dangerous threats from our ecosystems, or at least not when it comes to interoperability and not Apple. And then, so I think there you even see a bit of a contradiction with some of the other enforcement tools of the Commission. Last week, there was a report, press release from the Commission saying that they were, sorry, not last week, 2 weeks ago, 23rd of September, that requesting information under the Digital Services Act from Apple, Booking, Google, and Microsoft on financial scams, and calling out how, well, business users of some of these platforms might be messaging their end users and directing them off platform, and then fraudulently getting them to engage in transactions. It could be someone's account, a booking host's account has been hacked, and then that host sends messages to all the users who have made a booking, and then telling them, oh, you need to pay your deposit on the off-platform. So this kind of off-platform messaging, which can be very good, can also raise these kind of cybersecurity concerns. So I think there it's we'll have to see with the approach towards future enforcement and how these arguments are considered. I hope that with a good look at proportionality and good expertise from the high-level group coming in on to verify the veracity of these cybersecurity and concerns, that will not have a 2026 any sort of threat landscape that shows things that have dramatically gotten worse in Europe.
I kind of want to throw that to Thomas as well, because I know that the Commission's line is that that there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to comply with DMA and also comply with digital laws around privacy, digital laws around sort of content moderation and stuff. But this line of argument hasn't gone away. So how do you guys think about that tension?
It hasn't gone away, and it's also because it's lumped together, as Kai just did, in many different facets in one big ball. So you have to be a bit methodological about it. First of all, choice is a bit more costly in terms of fraud. I think that one must agree to. If you were to go to a supermarket, there was only one drink available. Obviously, it would be easier in terms of regulating it when it comes to sugar content. If you have like 300 drinks available, it's a bit more complicated. Right? Choice has a cost. Yeah, that's true, and people need to be more aware. Because the more choices you have, the more aware you need to be about threat. Nobody contests that there are threats out there, but the more choice you have, the more complicated your choices when it comes to threat environments become. So then one needs to distinguish between data protection and security and integrity. Data protection is something that really public authorities are in charge of. We wouldn't want to have gatekeepers being super data protection authorities on their own platforms. That's what the public authority is there to do. And now I'm going back to the past. In the Hilti judgment, that was also argued very forcefully, that there shouldn't be other there shouldn't be public authority should be regulating the size of the nails and not Hilti. So this is all an old story, actually, in new. An old story that we have already heard before. And then there's security and integrity, where we really come to your fraud issues. And there the DMA actually provides for that the gatekeepers should be able to take measures in order to protect the platform, so the integrity of the platform, and also the security of the users. And that's not denied. The only thing is, what we're hearing so far is none of these obligations can be put in place because of security concerns. And that has nothing to do with proportionality. That just means I'm not going to do it because I think there's too many security concerns around. A proportionality analysis would mean, what can you put in place as mitigating measures so that the security concerns are not overboarding? And that's what we need to be talking about. And that's exactly what our decisions talk about. The gatekeepers can take proportionate measures in order to protect users and the integrity of the systems.
Francesco, as well, I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that, because as somebody who represents one of the companies that seeks to benefit from the DMA, how do you guys feel about an accusation that comes from the gatekeepers that doing the very things that you want them to do to unlock their systems kind of opens up this Pandora's box of terror and cybersecurity risks?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is really like a top-level reasoning, which is that security is a very important issue and a very important societal goal as well, and it should be treated seriously. I think following on what Thomas just said, So first of all, it needs to be clear where the potential sources of breaches to that security come from and what's in place in order to mitigate that. Just saying the DMA is bad for security in my ecosystem, it's a very, very open statement that doesn't go into the granular, the important granularities of the concept. You may have developers and apps which invest a lot in security, like for example, we do, apps that invest less, and maybe they require some extra caution. It also varies a lot on the business model. And we see some, behind such important statement about such an important issue, we do see some contradictions in the way this is framed. For example, Apple says that one of the reasons they need to monetize via the fees on the App Store is actually to allow them to invest in the most secure possible platform for users. Perfect. But then why are they just levying fees on some developers and, for example, not on email providers, which are a great source of malware, or e-commerce platforms, where actually a lot of transactions happen? So if security is the very issue, why there is no charging at the source of the problem? So it seems to me that actually this shows that there is a way to hide certain competitive and business considerations behind a security framework, and that's not helpful for the debate.
I want to talk as well about the simplification process that we're going in the Commission at the moment. The digital omnibus is going to be something that comes out a little bit later. Certain pieces of EU legislation, such as GDPR, have kind of been floated as candidates for rules that definitely need simplification. I'd love to get the panel's thoughts on whether you think the DMA needs to be a candidate on that and why or why not. Thomas?
So the simplification is mostly about administrative burden and the focus is smaller companies, SMEs. So in the DMA context, we don't really deal with SMEs, we deal with large gatekeepers. Also the administrative burden on the gatekeepers in the context of the DMA is, I think, not the issue. That's why we follow a separate process here with the review. We are looking more at the substantive side of things, in order to see whether substantively, not in terms of administrative burden, but more in terms of substance, the DMA needs to be adapted or changed. And therefore, one needs to distinguish, I think, between the simplification exercise, which is really focused on administrative burden, and this review process, which we're currently undergoing. And here, we focus very much on substance.
Mm-hmm. So maybe simplification is perhaps the wrong thing to be looking at, but I think that one thing that you do notice when you look at some of the compliance reports that you've seen, or some of the spicier submissions to the DMA review process, is a complaint about just the practical burden of complying with the DMA. I seem to remember Meta in its first compliance report was saying that, saying it had spent thousands and thousands of hours of trying to, and got all of its engineers in one room to try and work out how to actually get its systems in place. So I'd love to talk a little bit about the cost of compliance and whether that's something that you do, whether you consider as well in terms of maybe not, simplification of actually the reporting process, but actually getting the systems into effect. Is that something that you do consider in terms of the effort the company's making? Do you think that that's a valid complaint?
Yeah. So I think with reference to what some of the complaints, the criticisms that some of the gatekeepers have put out there, it's again, and echoing what Thomas said, it's not the administrative side of it, but more rather the changes that they've had to make to the products. When Maria on the last panel mentioned this is kind of the science fiction of opening up Apple's walled garden, and these kind of business model changes involving also very deep technical changes, and Meta's statement, and also I think Amazon said something and at the workshops, and I think there's been similar statements from others generally about how it's hundreds and thousands of engineering hours that have been invested in these. And what I would hope to see is, the way to minimize that isn't simplification of reporting obligations, but part of it is we're in this process of learning and what does effective compliance look like, and that being a bit of an iterative process. So I think there's a lot of upfront work that is being done, and that's just inherent to the kind of the upfront work that is being done. But hopefully it's something where then the law, the interpretation of these obligations does become somewhat settled, and there isn't there's no more validity to this criticism of it being a moving target or there being shifting goalposts. And it's just kind of, okay, these are the rules. This is what it means to be a DMA compliant platform, and then companies can get on with doing business.
I think you really can only judge the cost of compliance if you do a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. The problem with the cost-benefit analysis is that there's a huge upfront cost for the companies in order to come into compliance, but the benefits will accrue over time. So we'll have to see how users and business users and end users basically can benefit over time from what the DMA does. So obviously it seems that compliance costs upfront are high, because all happened with a big bang, at the compliance date on the 7th of March last year. But the benefits will accrue over time, and it will be a gradual process. So I think it's too early basically to say the cost of compliance have been too high and the benefits have been too low, because we don't even know what the full benefits are going to be in 2 years' time. Then one can basically make the comparison, but for the time being, I would think that this is a too easy comparator.
Francisco, just wanted to get your thoughts on that as well. And I just wondered as well, as a company that is trying to shift things around in its own business operations in Europe to benefit from the DMA, are there additional costs that the company hadn't factored in before with doing that?
Yep, many things to say about this. First of all, I think we are rightly talking about simplification in Brussels, but that's linked to competitiveness. So the goal of the EU in that respect is not simplification for the sake of it, but to achieve competitiveness. And then Alexander Destrel talked about religion, so allow me to quote the Bible, which is the Draghi report. He clearly said that there is a difference between regulatory burden that affects companies across the board, and he made the examples of the AI Act and GDPR, and regulation that actually could open opportunities for businesses, and he mentioned the DMA. So I think we should not, again, put everything under the same, in the same basket. There is a lot of effort that also is required on developers to follow DMA compliance, for example, RFIs, for example, preparing for the workshop, studying the proposals and the terms that are on the table. We are a big company, of course, but we do have more limited resources in the gatekeepers, and analyzing these terms and making the impact assessment internally takes time and takes effort. So there is an element of that as well. I would also flag a last point. When we talk about simplification, we are now talking about regulatory burden. There is a lot of burden that comes from the gatekeepers. When I made the US example I made before, so before the Epic injunction, it took 8 steps for users to purchase an audiobook on Spotify, 8 steps. And now they can just do it with 1 click. That's a lot of burden that's been eased up. And you multiply that for X number of developers, X number of users. That's very important. And by the way, this is, I would like to thank Beuk, because they did an amazing job in actually looking at scare screens and the whole consumer journey on App Store. And I think they provided very much value to the discussion on that.
I'm glad that we're talking about that sort of simplification in terms of the App Store, in terms of like the actual user experience as well. Because I kind of wanted to talk about, okay, you mentioned, what does effective compliance look like? We've heard time and time again that eventually the DMA is meant to be this self-enforcing tool. So I kind of wanted to ask Thomas, is there a vision that you had for effective compliance going into the enforcement period? And how does what we're seeing now compare to that vision?
The complication in that is that the DMA is not focused on outcomes, it's focused on opportunities. And it's very difficult to measure how the opportunities have been taken up by business users. And that's why I come back to the indicator point that Alexandra de Strela mentions. If you have indicators, they don't really tell you why the people haven't followed up on the opportunities that the DMA has created. If, I don't know, X million users have downloaded or have not downloaded an alternative app store, what does it tell you? Does it tell you that the alternative app store is not as good as users would like it to be? Or does it mean there's too many hindrances on the way to download an alternative app store? So when you create opportunities to basically find the right indicator to measure them is not a straightforward exercise. So we need to be careful basically to put easy targets, I think, on the DMA to say there have to be X million of downloads, X million of installs. That would not do it justice, I think. We need to be a bit cleverer in terms of the indicators that we want to have for compliance. But what we obviously want is compliance in a pragmatic way that works for business users and end users, and that's what we are striving through mostly, and I have to repeat it, mostly through dialogue with the gatekeepers, and only in very extreme cases if it really doesn't work with the fines and the penalty payments and what have you.
I'm going to come back to this point in a little bit because I kind of want to talk about the future of how enforcement looks like in practice. But before we do that, I want to talk about the fact that the DMA is actually not the only piece of digital competition legislation out there. We're seeing the DMCC in the UK coming into effect. We're seeing kind of remedies being thought about at the same time as designations. So that's kind of a slightly different process to what we have in Europe. We're seeing laws in South Korea and Japan kind of coming into fruition, and Brazil as well. So I'd be interested to start with Francesco because we could talk a little bit more about your wish list in Europe. And I wondered if you have hopes for replicating that in other markets.
Yeah, sure. I mean, our wish list is really the same across all markets, but indeed we see different experiences. We are looking with a lot of hope at the DMCC, which is a very interesting instrument. It has some similarities with the DMA, but also some differences. For example, that the regulator will actually adopt and impose codes of conduct, which maybe is a slightly more flexible approach than the DMA. So we are looking forward to seeing how that works in practice, and also CMA is a very serious and also well-resourced regulator. We have the US experience, which came a bit abruptly, but actually is very helpful to show a counterfactual to everything that we're talking about, because we have a live example in one of the largest markets of really free of charge steering. We have Brazil indeed, and Eastern markets. We are waiting to see what comes out of those. Obviously, the DMA is first in line in terms of maturity, but we are also looking at all the other examples. And if we see that one of these examples leads to different outcomes, good or bad, that could also be interesting from a DMA perspective, we'll definitely share those publicly and with the Commission.
And Thomas, how obviously the Brussels effect continues to be alive and well if we see, these regulations in other markets as anything to go by. So how are you working with counterparts in South Korea, counterparts in Japan? I think you mentioned before that there's a little bit of secondment going on. You have some people coming into the Commission to work with you guys. If you could go into a bit of detail about that, that'd be great.
The Brussels effect is not something we are striving for. That is happening. The judge in Australia was mentioned. He used the DMA as an example for his judgment. That's not something that we have imposed or have encouraged him to do. He's done that on his own. What we are encouraging is the conversations that we're having with other authorities, the JFTC, for example, if their mobile law. So we have a lot of conversations with them. As you said, there's a secondment going on currently with a colleague from the JFTC working in the DMA team. We are discussing also with our friends in the UK. They're a bit, I don't want to say behind, but they're a bit later than we are in the enforcement. But obviously there's an interest in exchanging And also with those jurisdictions that enforce antitrust law, but with a similar aim, actually, because when people talked about the differences between the US and the EU, if you look at the goals or the aims of the ongoing cases, it's very much similar. You look at the Google cases, especially the one on search, or you look at the filings against Apple in the US, you see a lot of similarities with what you find in DMA work. So if you look globally, there's quite some convergence actually between those jurisdictions that have this kind of regulatory tool, but also those which don't, but which use antitrust, classical antitrust, to basically pursue the same goals.
That's interesting. I don't want to go too much into the US stuff because I feel like that's going to come up in a few different panels, but just to get your perspective on that, because of the actual cases, the concrete stuff that you're seeing happening, do you see the language that certain members of certain factions within antitrust in the US use at certain conferences in certain places in Scotland? Do we see that as more like window dressing, or what do you think?
I think what really matters is what the courts are doing. And if you look at what the courts are doing, it's very much aligned with what the Commission has been doing over the years in terms of tech and enforcement. As I said, you look at the Google cases, the Apple case of the DOJ, the FTC Amazon case. If you then compare with what the Commission has been doing, I see a lot of resemblance, actually.
Okay, I just want to throw to you as well, since we're talking about what's happening in other markets. How do you see that evolving, and what about your partners? How do they feel about the fact that there's this kind of like emerging landscape of regulation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff, and even the DMA itself was designed with the idea that there's been a history of cases, antitrust cases, that we can learn from, that we can kind of do it once and for all in a regulation. We don't have to continue to do it by case assessment for these markets. So I think there is a lot of logic there, and to a large extent, that's where there is growing international alignment. I do worry a little bit, though, with some of the obligations under the DMA. Again, sorry to harp again on interoperability, which go much further than what we see anywhere else. I mean, the DMA's interoperability obligations, the access obligations, they go beyond anything we see in telecoms, anything we see in banking. The fact that they're basically saying free of charge, turning a closed ecosystem into an open ecosystem, having your rivals involved in your product roadmap before you've announced anything, having to roll out something immediately for your rivals' access at the same time as you would launch anything for yourself. That is the kind of thing where I don't think there's a lot of international alignment, and where I think the US administration would be the most opposed to any kind of international alignment, because it's taking the idea of like, okay, we have open markets and open trade into kind of like what Thomas, maybe I misunderstood, but you said, well, we need to do a cost-benefit analysis if this is better for everyone overall, even if it's bad for the gatekeeper. And I worry that kind of thinking of like, oh, well, we can just impose obligations on a company because it's for the public good. That is a little bit risky, and I think that's where there will not be as much international alignment.
I'm conscious that I want to make sure that we've got enough time for questions, but I just want to follow up with one final point to cross over. So, you know, we are where we are in terms of enforcement against mobile ecosystems now. So I guess the big thing is what happens next. Say at the end of the year, the Commission decides that it's happy with the changes that Apple has made to its App Store so far. Say that we get to a point eventually where the Commission's happy with whatever Google leaves now, or maybe does any even further changes with Google Play. What does enforcement against those platforms or with those platforms look like in the future when it becomes a more iterative process?
Again, it's not about enforcement. This is antitrust terminology. It's about regulation. So obviously, regulation. Once you're a regulated entity, you don't escape that easily. So you'll be a regulated entity for a longer period of time. And there's the really stark difference with antitrust, where we basically have one-off cases. And you look at specific conduct in a specific time frame, then you sanction it, and then it's basically okay. Impose a remedy. That's it. In the regulatory context, it works differently. You know? Markets change, products evolve, so there needs to be a constant dialogue with the regulator, and that's what regulation is about, and that's different from antitrust. So I guess if you're happy with what has been rolled out, or what will be rolled out in the next couple of months, then we will take note of it. But if then the market evolves or the technology evolves or products evolve, we'll have to come back to it. I mean, that's what regulation is about. And we'll have to be in a constant dialogue with the regulated companies.
And to Kay and Francesco as well, as people who kind of like, you know, on the other side of that and have skin in the game and are kind of the ones who are responding to RFIs in the market, what do you want enforcement, the regulatory process to look like?
Yeah, I won't speculate about process and what happens in a few months. I'll just say that what we see right now on the table is really, that doesn't really move the needle from before the commission issued their non-compliance decision back in April. Because I'm Italian. Allow me to quote an Italian book called The Leopard. Netflix made a great series about that. The key sentence in that, this is about a Sicilian aristocrat who sees revolution coming from Garibaldi troops, but wants to keep his privilege. And the key sentence is, we need to change everything so that everything stays the same. And we see that's exactly what Apple is doing with the fees. They're fees on new things, but if you look at the package, it's the same. So that's where we see it right now, and we hope that eventually it will get better than this.
Okay, final thoughts?
Yeah, I hope we get to this space of stability soon. Actually, hopefully not too controversial, but I hope we get more antitrust enforcement in the digital space and not DMA enforcement, because it would be nice to bring new cases on new theories of harm and not rely on the DMA for everything. Because I really worry that the DMA is seen a little bit as a tool of kind of general digital market control, deciding which companies are allowed to create new products and how, and directing the course of innovation, rather than addressing known harms and solving those problems and then letting market competition work again.
Great, thanks very much, guys. So now I throw out to the audience. Does anybody have any questions for us? I see Christoph's raised his hand. Could you say who you are, where you're from, favorite color, you know, that sort of thing?
Thank you, Edith, and Christoph Carati from Digital Competition. So I have a question that is making the bridge between everyone what said and the previous panel. So imagine a world where in 2 years we have this conversation again, and so we listen. Alexandre said we need indicators. We said Jan Foster said we need settlement, and I can imagine a world where Spotify will be in the panel and say, I still want this wish list, and Apple say, I still want privacy, security, and fee. And my question is, how we can have kind of, let's say, vision on the DMA, who is defining this vision between law and policies? And because I have the feeling that if we keep this framework about we listen everyone, but at the end of the day, we don't have a clear vision about what we want to achieve really, the DMA would not move, and basically you would still keep the same argument. And say, I know it's a very difficult question, but how can we, granted that we cannot have indicators because this is not the purpose of the DMA, in that situation, what we should look like for a kind of broader vision of the DMA. I don't know if you have any answer on that.
Who wants to take that?
It's indeed a difficult one because the goals are prescribed in a relatively general manner. No? It's the fairness and the contestability goal. To measure contestability is not an easy exercise. But what you ideally want to see is that more businesses take up opportunities that the DMA offers. And then the second tier question is, how do you measure that? And as I was trying to say before, do you measure it in pure quantitative figures, or do you have to make a more qualitative assessment? Basically go out to businesses and ask them, was this useful for you? Have you benefited, or from what have you benefited? You'd have to do these kind of surveys, I guess, if you really wanted to get to the bottom of has the DMA opened up opportunities for businesses as it was intended to.
I'll add, the DMA, as you're kind of alluding to, puts the Commission in the unenviable position of arbitrating these disputes between business users and gatekeepers. And I think it'll be interesting if we get to a point where the Commission says, well, no more wish list, you've had enough of the things on your wish list and we're not growing the wish list anymore. And that point where, okay, there's kind of an arbitration and a balance between, okay, that's enough, that then we'll have this stability. But it is the Commission's responsibility ultimately, I think, to come in and figure out what that point is.
The only thing I would add is that eventually in 2 years, as you mentioned, there will be more data, more evidence from businesses. There will be new terms on the table, and it will be possible to assess them and see if they move the needle towards the DMA goals, regardless of individual wish lists. And then I think that's what the Commission will be doing, and they've already done it to some extent. So I hope there will be different discussions at that point in time.
I see a gentleman at the front, his hand raised. Did you have your hand raised? Yes. Okay, good.
Alex Tursky, Post Patents Foundation. I think we are missing some big elephant in the room. In the physical life, when I come to this conference, I have this badge. It's my name, Alex Tursky. If you ask me how can I prove, I just say, well, that's my passport. And I also bring with me my data. So 3 elements, data, passport, and my identifier. DMA and GDPR, they usually deal with my data things. ADAS regulation, it's about passport, but actually I see no regulation about this name thing. It seems like not important, but that's very crucial. When I buy a washing machine at one platform, when I go to another platform, I want them to sell me washing powder, but they keep on selling me washing machine because they don't know is it the same Alex Tursky. So identifiers on all platforms are all different. We need something to be my own. I want to have ownership not only of my data, but my identity. I have this certain number. And I think we need to start thinking in this direction because identifier for me, for companies, for every bottle of milk, by the way, we are talking about 10 in the power of 25 identifiers. It's a very big subject which probably should be addressed by regulators somehow, not only data and passports.
Any reflections?
I think the DMA does go some distance in already providing for that. With the not requiring you to have a gatekeeper service, I think you don't need a Gmail account anymore to be on Android. So it's a matter of, do the majority of people or do people at all agree and want to do their own independent thing that they can use on all services? And that's something that, if it's like Thomas was saying, it's about creating that opportunity, but if people don't do it, then there are other questions to ask, but it's not for the Commission to force people to do it, I think, if I didn't misunderstand.
We are pressed for time, so I'm going to allow 2 more questions, I think. There was a woman at the back who had one. Okay, there's a gentleman there, and then the woman at the back as well.
Thank you. I'm Shubhani Ojla from Dibra Blackstone Westbrook. My question concerns Spotify, but I would like to hear more from Thomas about it. And that's like, we all talk about fairness and contestability in digital markets, and music streaming is a digital market. And Spotify is a market leader in that, whereas the gatekeeper, Apple, is the market challenger. But the DMS sort of put us in a situation where the market challenger has to respond to the wish list of the market leader. And that makes me curious about the process of competition between these 2 major players in music streaming services and how this interferes with that regular process of competition.
We have a whole antitrust decision about that. Apple might be the challenger in music streaming, but it's certainly not the challenger in the distribution of apps. And one of the ingredients to have a music streaming app distributed is you had to be in the App Store. With the DMA, there's other opportunities, but they still have to unfold. So we're not talking about a challenger up against, we're talking about 2 different, in antitrust terms, markets, in DMA terms, gatekeeper positions. So the gatekeeper position is on the App Store, not on the music streaming market. Or market, I shouldn't say, CPS, core platform service.
And I think we'll have time for one last question.
Thank you. This is Lucia Stoican from Linklaters. Thanks a lot for this interesting debate. And maybe just to wrap up, one question for Spotify and one question for the Commission. So Spotify is claiming on the one hand that Apple has restricted it from communicating to users in the Spotify app that they can do the premium subscription outside the app. So either on your website, on Safari, either on your desktop. But on the other hand, all users app, all Spotify users in the EU were prohibited for, I think, 10 years to subscribe to premium in the Spotify app. So how many people in this room have done their premium Spotify subscription in the app? I think not too many, because it is uncontested that Spotify has turned off this possibility, I think in 2014 probably. We are basically forced to do our Spotify premium subscriptions outside the app. So what we were discussing about convenience and choice and 7 more clicks and so on. We all knew about this possibility from other communication channels, but that's not my question. My question is, why was I, a Spotify premium user, deprived of my choice to subscribe to premium in the Spotify app? And Apple was fined 1.8 billion euros for this. And my second question is for the Commission. Isn't that an abuse of dominance? Isn't that an unfair trading term, given that Spotify has probably 60-70% market share in the music streaming services market as established by the Commission in the Spotify case? Isn't that a loss of choice and of opportunities for consumers? Thank you.
Yeah, I think your question actually is very much in line with what I was saying before. The reason why we discontinued the possibility to subscribe within the app is exactly because of the fees. So if you do the math, actually, you put together 70% of revenues to right holders, and you add on top of that a 30% for the first year, which becomes 15 from the second year, for the lifetime of the user. You do the math, and actually you see that eventually a business with no or low margins has either to increase prices or to take other choices. And this is why we had to do this. Trust me, we would have loved to actually allow this seamless experience in app. I would not be on this panel today to talk about it. I think that's pretty much it from my perspective. The other thing I would mention is that if you don't like Spotify, you want to move to another streaming provider, you have vast choice in the market. And yes, we are in some markets the market leader, but as Thomas said, that's not the point of the DMA. It's not about market leaders. But you can migrate. If you are on the Apple App Store, you want to keep your iPhone, but you want to have another app store, another distribution, you just couldn't do it pre-DMA. It's very different.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Right, well, we are a little bit over time. I do apologize for that. But thank you very much for my lovely panelists, and thank you for the lovely audience for listening in as well.